and we need to increase the number of visas that are available and speed up processing time. That's why we must also pass this bill. No ally or their family should be left behind. Second is H.R. 2467. Many people may not realize it, but harmful so-called forever chemicals are found in many of the products that we use every day, from food packaging to cookware to clothing, even firefighting foam. They have this nickname because these chemical compounds don't break down easily. They stick around and pollute our drinking water, harm our environment, and threaten public health. Unfortunately, these forever chemicals are not yet designated as other harmful chemicals are, and this bill directs the EPA to finally designate forever chemicals as hazardous substances to better protect Americans' health and the environment in communities all across the country. Lastly, we will consider H.R. 2668. Americans reported losing more than $3.3 billion to fraud in 2020. That's billion with a B. Our seniors, our military families, and immigrants are particularly vulnerable. This legislation will help the Federal Trade Commission get refunds for those harmed by this telecommunications fraud and other illegal scams. And let me just say before I yield to the ranking member, we tried the best we can to work with Democratic and Republican members to try to make amendments in order, but I've been noticing on the amendment dealing with the forever chemicals, the PFAS bill, that virtually every Republican amendment that has been introduced has a point of order against it. And so we have been trying, they've offered to work with Republicans to try to help adjust these amendments so that, in fact, there's not a point of order against them. And I think we're being informed kind of that as a group, they're not interested in doing that. And I think that's regrettable because I think it may mean that we're not going to be able to be very accommodating on that particular bill. And so, I don't know whether it's about people making political statements or about whether or not they seriously want to move ideas forward on the floor, but we need to, obviously, in this committee, I mean, we have to, we conduct ourselves in a way where we, would like to see if we can make them in order so there aren't points of order against them. But in any event, we will see what happens before this hearing is through. But with that, let me yield to the ranking member for any comments that he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here on 3 items, as you suggest. I'll start with the 2 coming from the Committee of Energy and Commerce. Both are partisan bills. It really should have been bipartisan ones. First is H.R. 2467, the PFAS Action Act. Our committee considered a very similar bill last Congress, so this will be familiar to our returning members. Like the version from last Congress, H.R. 2467 is unfortunately a partisan bill. The bill is intended to address contamination and environmental problems caused by 2 groups of chemicals that everyone in both parties agree are a problem. But though there is a bipartisan consensus that these 2 groups of chemicals pose an environmental problem, there's a consensus that Congress should act, the majority has once again chosen to go it alone. Rather than putting forth bipartisan solutions, as Congress did on this exact topic in both 2020 and 21 NDAA reauthorization bills, majorities instead once again declaring that it's their way or the highway. Truly, as Yogi Berra once said, it's deja vu all over again. H.R. 2467 uses heavy-handed top-down solutions that would override the existing process at the EPA and that are not supported by science. The problems posed by these chemicals are ones that can and should be addressed by consensus, but we cannot accomplish that goal without thoughtful input from the broader scientific community and a thorough process at the EPA. This bill would prevent both from happening. I strongly encourage my friends in the majority to rethink this course of action. Our second item is H.R. 2668, the Consumer Protection and Recovery Act. The bill is intended to overturn a Supreme Court decision from April of 2021 that held that the Federal Trade Commission Act does not give the FTC the authority to seek or a court the authority to award equitable monetary relief. The bill before us would specifically add that ability for both the FTC and the courts into statute. Unfortunately, like our first item, H.R. 2668 is a partisan bill. During the markup at Energy and Commerce Committee, the Republican members expressed concerns with various provisions in this bill. The bill has an unreasonable statute of limitations, does not include guardrails to prevent the FTC from exceeding its authority, and fails to include other important priorities like increasing transparency, ensuring the FTC incorporates economic analysis before proceeding to an enforcement action. Each of these concerns could and should have been addressed through a bipartisan process. I'd remind my friends in the majority again that they're unfortunately going down a road to simply make political points rather than make law. They truly want to govern, then continuing to go it alone on partisan bills is ultimately self-defeating. Mr. Chairman, Congress works best when the two parties work together, when we actually seek bipartisan consensus. That consensus results in better solutions for the American people. I'd remind my friends that it's not too late to change direction, and I hope that the majority will choose an alternative path. Finally, our last item is H.R. 3985, the Allies Act. This bill addresses concerns with the special immigrant visa program for our Afghan allies. It would increase the number of SIV program visas by 8,000 and simplify the requirements for the program for those who supported American military operations in Afghanistan. This is particularly important in the wake of the decision by the Biden administration to withdraw American military personnel from Afghanistan. I understand that Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over this issue, have some concerns about that legislation. I look forward to hearing their testimony today, but in the end, I'm sure I'll be supporting this for humanitarian reasons that you outlined in your own remarks. Certainly, we need to help our friends get out of harm's way and honor our commitments in that direction. I'm sure we can find a way to work together on that and look forward to that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ranking Member Cole yields back. I want to thank him for his opening. I now would like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 3985, the Allies Act. Representatives Raskin and Ranking Member Jordan, we are delighted that you are here. I will now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for his opening remarks. Yeah, you can sit wherever you want to sit.
Mr. Chairman,
make sure it's on. That's all. Okay, good.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cole, distinguished members of the Rules Committee, it's a great pleasure to be with you on this side of the table. H.R. 3985, the Averting Loss of Life and Injury by Expediting SIVs Act of 2021, the Allies Act, is a really critical piece of legislation that will streamline the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program and strengthen the protections for the people who faithfully served right alongside American troops in Afghanistan and made the entire mission there possible for us. The Special Immigrant Visa Program allows people who work for or on behalf of the U.S. government in Afghanistan or for the NATO International Security Assistance Force in support of the American mission to seek lawful permanent residence in the United States. To be eligible, they have to establish qualifying employment in Afghanistan for a period of 2 years, which is actually a really long time. My office, unfortunately, was unable to help some people who had served for 18 months or, a year, which is a long time in the middle of a war, but this is a 2-year requirement. They must receive approval from the chief of mission, and they have to undergo rigorous background checks and national security vetting, a process that itself, on average, takes 3 years. Our 20-year mission in Afghanistan formally comes to an end in just a few weeks. Each day that we continue to draw down our military presence, the threats to the lives of Afghan people who supported our cause are increasing dramatically. As such, it's essential that we take urgent action now to expedite the processing of these visas without compromising national security, of course, and fulfill our obligation to protect the men and women whose lives are at risk today because of their support and their service to the United States and our policies in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. The Allies Act will do just that. First, it increases the number of visas that may be issued to qualifying Afghans by 8,000. I think there are around 11,000 left now, and it increases it by 8,000 to accommodate the huge demand that's coming. This is the number of visas that we have to authorize to ensure that qualifying individuals who are awaiting adjudication of their applications can immediately receive a visa once they are approved through the process. Second, the bill streamlines visa processing in several ways. It does this by giving the agencies the flexibility to reduce duplicative paperwork requirements while maintaining the core components of the adjudication, that applicants establish qualifying employment, that they receive the approval of the chief of mission, that they pass all criminal background and national security checks, and they prove that they are not otherwise inadmissible to the United States under American law. H.R. 3985 also removes the requirement that applicants prove the existence of an ongoing serious threat specifically to themselves. It instead requires applicants articulate a credible basis for concern about an ongoing serious threat, and that such threat will be confirmed upon establishing qualifying employment. Third, the bill strengthens protections for certain groups of Afghan nationals, including surviving spouses and children of deceased principal applicants, individuals employed by NATO in support of the U.S. mission, and individuals whose work was funded by a U.S. government cooperative agreement or grant. Obviously, a lot of interpreters and other critical aids came through those kinds of grant programs. Collectively, these changes are going to ensure that no one whose lives are at risk today because of their support for the American mission in Afghanistan are abandoned or forced to wait for Congress to act sometime in the indefinite future to authorize more visas. Further, the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security will no longer be bound to redundant paperwork requirements that slow down processing of these critical applications. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this important bill. I want to thank Representative Crow of Colorado for championing the cause of our Afghan allies and those in Congress working across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats alike, to build consensus and widespread support for this legislation. We must do right by these people. Their lives are literally in our hands. Their families are counting on us. I urge all my colleagues to support 3985. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just start by associating myself with the remarks of the ranking member. I think this bill makes sense. It needs to happen. But there are legitimate concerns. First, I think the first concern overall is just the process. This legislation continues. Unfortunately, the trend we have seen from the majority of going around committee, bypassing regular order, and when you're talking about an issue of this magnitude, where we're talking about lives and we're also dealing with immigration, it seems like we could have had some hearings on this. Judiciary Committee held no hearings on the legislation. In addition to that, late Friday, the chairman filed a manager's amendment to make substantive changes to the bill text. I know that providing immigration benefits for Afghan nationals who worked for the U.S. government during a 20-year period of having U.S. troops in the country is an issue of critical importance. I think we all understand that. And I, too, like Congressman Raskin, appreciate the work of Mr. Crow and Mr. Winstrup and others who, in a bipartisan way, worked on this legislation. But this bill and members of Congress would have benefited from an exchange of information and ideas that regular order always provides. In 2009, Congress passed the Afghan Allies Protection Act. This law created a program to provide green cards, special immigrant visas, to Afghan nationals and their spouse and children who worked for or on behalf of the United States government for at least 1 year and who experienced an ongoing serious threat as a result of that employment. In order to be issued a green card, applicants for this program must be eligible under the broader requirements of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Since the program's inception, over 15,500 green cards have been issued to principal applicants, and according to the administration, each principal applicant brings with him or her to the United States an average of 3.5 family members. We are thankful that thousands of Afghan nationals chose to work with our government and our contractors. Unfortunately, but Congress should have had a full debate and discussion about the policy and whether making changes to the program is in fact necessary. Unfortunately, the Democrats did not do that. H.R. 3985 makes changes to the Afghan Allies Protection Act, which supporters hope will reduce the time it takes to process green card applications. Last week, President Biden announced that in light of the American troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, the U.S. government will begin evacuation flights for 18,000 Afghan special immigrant visa applicants and their families. Thus, any danger that these Afghanis face based on the Taliban takeover will be mitigated, and the U.S. government will be able to fully adjudicate applications without feeling the pressure of possible danger to the applicant. The Democrats have also taken away the ability to debate whether Congress really needs to authorize 8,000 additional green cards for the program at this time. There are currently 10,000 green cards that have been authorized but not yet issued for this program. Issuing 10,000 green cards through this program is a huge undertaking given the background checks and other requirements. When the available 10,000 green cards are used, Congress should weigh authorizing more at that time. I'm sure another reason there's also concerns about this legislation from many of us is the cost. It's going to cost approximately $1 billion. Had this bill gone through regular order, we also could have debated whether it's a good idea to increase the eligibility pool for the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program. Despite requests for the information, the Biden administration was unable to determine how many more individuals may be eligible for the program. The manager amendment, filed late Friday, only raises more question. Chairman Nadler's amendment reverses the requirement that Afghan special immigrant visas applicants show that they have experienced an ongoing serious threat as a consequence of their employment. Applicants will only need to have, quote, asserted a credible basis for concern about the possibility of a threat. If these individuals are in danger from the Taliban, as proponents claim, they should have no problem meeting the serious threat requirement, and there is no need to alter it. The new standard, I think this is important, the new standard is even lower than the current asylum credible fear standard. How many more individuals will be eligible for the program pursuant to this change? What are the consequences of such a low standard? We don't know. But the chairman's amendment, manager's amendment, also increases the eligibility pool for this program. Let's be clear, this is no longer just a program for Afghan nationals who helped our military men and women with their mission. Instead, to get a green card, you just need to have contributed to the United States mission in Afghanistan through a cooperative agreement or grant funded by the U.S. government. What does that mean? How many people will the Biden administration deem to have contributed to the United States mission in Afghanistan? We don't really know. The amendment only also makes it easier to apply for a green card by eliminating the requirement that applicants file certain forms with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. What are the ramifications of implementing that requirement? Again, we don't know because we didn't have debate on the legislation. Congress should be able to answer all these questions, but we can't because the Democrats are moving the bill and this new amendment to the floor before we've had a chance to have any real debate or discussion or consideration of the policies. Mr. Chairman, again, with all that being said, I understand this legislation is needed. I think you're going to have broad support from those of us on the Judiciary Committee and in the Congress. I just wish we could have addressed some of these concerns and had real debate on this, but I appreciate the chance to be here with you today and appreciate the Rules Committee entertaining this and would yield back my time.
All right, thank you very much. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the statement of the administration policy on this bill. And let me just say for the record, I mean, I share my colleagues' preference for regular order, but I think this piece of legislation has significant bipartisan support, and quite frankly, I kind of hope this would be brought up under suspension, but we can't get a commitment that we have the votes to pass on the suspension, so we're going this route. But I think the men and women in Afghanistan who aided our mission for what I think has probably been the longest war in our history, their lives are in the balance, and they need help now. And so I hope this will pass with an overwhelming bipartisan vote. Again, my preference at this point would have been that we could have brought it up under suspension, but I don't think that that's, we can't get an assurance of that. So in any event, I thank you both for being here. I yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Just quickly, and just my judgment, and I understand you being cautious, but I do think it will pass with that kind of margin. I certainly hope it does. But I share my colleague from Ohio's concern. I just think we might have made it a better product. I mean, for instance, I think, Mr. Askins, you made a really good point about the arbitrary nature of the time limit. I happen to agree with your remarks. A year, you know, something, if we'd gone through this, maybe we could have that. Maybe we should revisit this at some point. I mean, I'm forgetting this vehicle through now. Don't misunderstand me, but I do worry about people falling through the cracks in situations like this, or an arbitrary timeline, which, again, I agree very much with the point that you made. If you did this for 18 months, that's good enough for me. You know, if you helped us in a substantive way, or if you put your life on the line. I was pleased to see some of the inclusions for people who were working on missions to help Afghan women. That might not be direct military support, but that's certainly going to put your life in danger with the Taliban. And that was part of our mission to try and do that. So anyway, I don't have any substantive questions other than to reinforce the point. Hopefully we can go through, I think even a single hearing and committee meeting or a markup would have probably yielded a product with a little bit more flexibility and probably would have absolutely made sure this would pass with overwhelming margins. But again, certainly not going to get in the way of me supporting something like this to help people get out of harm's way that put themselves in danger for our country, as well as their own. So with that comment, I'll yield back, Mr.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. So I actually just had lunch with my interpreter from Iraq yesterday. It's very timely. I prosecuted in Iraq, and I can tell you without interpreters, it would be impossible to do it, of course. But just a few things, and this committee probably is not used to this, but I agree with you, Congressman Raskin. And, I think, yeah, you never thought I'd say that, did you?
You want to capture that somehow?
We should have it.
That's right.
Move to adjourn.
I can assure you, I'm feeling fine. I agree with Congressman Raskin. Just a few quick points. The point about the 2-year time period being the Taliban doesn't care if you work for a day or 10 years. They're gonna go after you. So then also the vetting process. We already vet the linguists anyhow. They're vetted if they're working with the coalition forces or with our forces at least. And then as far as the caps go, there's no need. The test should be: did you work for the U.S. military or an NGO that was aiding our mission over there? So I just wanted to make those brief points, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't associate my remarks with Mr. Jordan and Ranking Member Cole. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perlmutter.
Yeah, just a quick statement, following up on what Mr. Reschenthaler said, we contemplated this back in 2009 when we thought the war was going to wind down way back then. And Mr. Jordan, you and I worked on this bill and some similar language. So I just appreciate kind of the expansion that we've taken because now it is happening fast. And I think that time is of the essence. So I appreciate your comments about, geez, we needed to do this, this, and this. And in normal settings, maybe we could. But I just appreciate both of you being here. I support this bill. And I'm not going to cross-examine you, Mr. Raskin, because I think you did a fairly good job presenting the bill.
Thank you. Before I yield to Ms. Fishback, I want to compliment Mr. Reschenthaler on drinking Polar Seltzer. If you'll notice, it's made in Worcester, Massachusetts, my home city. I really appreciate that. I mean, you have many seltzers to pick from, but you pick Polar. I appreciate it.
I can tell you, it is delicious.
Yeah. Ms. Fishback.
And Mr. Chair, I just never know how to follow that. But maybe it has something to do with the seltzer he's drinking that he's agreeing with Congressman Raskin now. But Mr. Chair, I'd simply like to associate myself with the comments of Ranking Member Jordan, Ranking Member Cole, and Congressman Reschenthaler.
Thank you.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to see this bill moving forward. For 5, 6, 7 years before coming to Congress, I was part of a program that represented translators and drivers who were seeking to receive the visas they'd been promised for helping our service members through the IRAP program. And some of you may remember a particularly brutal John Oliver segment in which he demonstrated the fact that it was easier for service members to bring a donkey back from Iraq at that time than it was to help translators or drivers get into the country, given the levels of security and the delays inherent in this program. So we need to do better by these folks who've helped our service members, and hopefully this act is part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to reiterate what others have already said, I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill. I don't think there's anything more fundamental than when America gives its word that it's going to help secure the safety and well-being of people who help us in times of armed conflict. If we ever want to have people anywhere else in the world stand with Americans and be supportive of the men and women who are out as our war fighters, this is a moral obligation of this nation. So I support not only the rule, but the underlying bill. I want to thank the gentleman for bringing it to the committee.
Thank you. Mr. DeSagne.
I have nothing to add, Mr. Chairman, other than my enthusiastic support for Polar Seltzer.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to add my enthusiastic support for this bill and the recognition that our Afghan allies deserve the same recognition as American troops, and the least we can do is protect them from the Taliban and provide them with the opportunity to build lives in the United States. My state of North Carolina is fortunate to be home to many of our Afghan allies who have relocated to the United States using the Afghan Special Immigration Visa Program, and I know that my community will benefit from allowing more of these heroes and partners to build lives here and in North Carolina. And this bill will ensure that our nation keeps its promises to its allies and its troops, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Does any other member wish to ask a question of the panel? Hearing none, you are dismissed. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. Does any other member wish to testify on H.R. 3985? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 3985. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 2467, the PFAS Action Education, the PFAS Action Act of 2021. Representative Dingle and Representative Carter. We're delighted to have you. I don't see. Well, let me recognize now the distinguished gentlewoman from Michigan, Congresswoman Dingle, for any opening remarks you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's meeting. It's always great to be with the ranking member as well and allowing me to testify on important bipartisan legislation to protect the American people and our environment from harmful forever chemicals. I'm proud to be here today to support H.R. 2467, the PFAS Action Act of 2021, which I introduced with my friend and colleague from Michigan, Congressman Fred Upton. This bill brings together a comprehensive package of provisions to test PFAS chemicals, limit pollution, clean up contamination, and protect public health. PFAS chemicals are an urgent threat to public health. This class of man-made chemicals are extremely persistent in the environment and have long been linked with adverse health effects, including cancer, immune system effects, infertility, impaired child development, high cholesterol, and thyroid disease. These harmful chemicals didn't exist on this earth before World War II. They were birthed as a byproduct of the Manhattan Project. And now, after generations of use to create our modern society, nearly every American, including every one of you that are listening to me today, have PFAS in your blood. Industry has known about these dangers for decades, that we still have no federal protections from PFAS in drinking water, no limits on PFAS air emissions, no federal cleanup requirements for PFAS sites, and no limits on dumping PFAS into our waterways. We don't even have simple labeling requirements for PFAS ingredients to allow consumers to protect themselves. As you may know, my home state of Michigan has been hit hard by PFAS contamination. But that's only because we're one of the few states spending the time and the money to look for it. Michigan has also acted under both Republican and Democratic administrations to establish the necessary policies to protect human health and the environment in the absence of strong federal leadership. But this truly is a national crisis, and more states are going to find similar contamination when they look. Because when you're dealing with substances that last forever, they never go away. It's only a matter of time. According to the Environmental Working Group, over 200 million Americans are drinking contaminated water. And we know, it's been documented, that 328 military sites across the United States have identified PFAS contamination. The longer we delay action, the worse the problem becomes. It's time for Congress to act and use every tool available to stop the flow of PFAS pollution into the environment and into our bodies. This important bill reflects the work of many Democratic members and a lot of Republicans too, who have seen the direct impact of PFAS in their districts and their communities. The PFAS crisis and this bill have received numerous hearings and markups in the Energy and Commerce Committee. After the bill passed out of committee last Congress in January 2020, the full House of Representatives took bold action and passed the PFAS Action Act by a vote of 247 to 159, including 24 Republicans supporting this package. I want to thank all of those members and my dear friend and colleague, Mr. Upton, for his partnership on this bipartisan bill. It's one of his communities that was really poisoned. Today, we're considering a largely identical version that warrants strong, continued bipartisan support, as well as support from every member of Congress. I want to thank the Rules Committee for once again considering this important bipartisan legislation. This is a comprehensive and meaningful bill that will make a positive difference in protecting the health and the well-being of all Americans long-term from these forever chemicals. I urge the members of this committee to support the PFAS Action Act, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you for your leadership on this. This is an issue that I think all of our states are very much concerned with. I did a hearing with a state legislator in my district last week, Senator Joe Comerford, who is sounding the alarm bells on PFAS and the health effects and how we approach this and how states should approach it. I also want to ask unanimous consent, if I could at this point, to insert in the congressional record the statement of administration policy, which says that the administration supports passage of H.R. 2467, the PFAS Action Act. And so, and before I go any further, let me recognize the gentleman. Let me represent Representative Carter from Georgia for any comments he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry y'all are late.
And just make sure your mic is on. Yeah. And there's oxygen in the back room if you need it.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it and apologize for my tardiness. Mr. Chairman, I'm before you today representing Republicans on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and I'm speaking in opposition to the bill, if you can imagine that. Let me start by saying and emphasizing, and I mean this sincerely, we know that contamination from PFAS is a serious problem. We acknowledge that, we understand that, and we want to properly address PFAS contamination in communities across the country. But this bill takes a radical regulatory approach to an entire class of chemicals. Keep in mind, PFAS represents 9,252 chemicals. It's an entire class. It's not just one or two chemicals, 9,252. It's important to, first of all, acknowledge that PFAS are an entire class of chemicals. In fact, the EPA's master list of PFAS substances contains, as I said, 9,252 distinct chemicals. Of those, significant research, of those 9,252, significant research has only been done on two out of 9,252. Indeed, exposure to those two specific chemicals has been linked to negative health effects like high cholesterol, thyroid disease, and certain cancers. However, both of those are no longer made in the United States. They've been voluntarily phased out by industry, and more research is being done to further understand PFAS. The thousands of other PFAS can be found in a wide range of consumer products like non-stick cookware, water-resistant clothing, cleaning products, and cosmetics. They are used in incredibly important things. PFAS are used in medical devices and drugs already approved by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, aircraft parts, semiconductors, clean energy technology, and protective gear for military and police. During the markup of this bill, Republicans on the committee highlighted many of the essential uses for PFAS and proposed amendments to protect them. Unfortunately, all those amendments were rejected. One critical issue, this bill, is that it applies its requirements and actions to every single one of the 9,252 PFAS, regardless of whether there is any actual data or science showing they harm humans. This will result this will result in a de facto ban of all PFAS chemicals. Not only would they have detrimental effects on society and our economy, it ignores the important work that has been done so far to understand PFAS. Listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle arguing in favor of this bill could lead one to believe that little to nothing is being done to address PFAS. That's simply not true. Over the last 2 years, 31 new statutory provisions became law. These measures ban certain use of PFAS chemicals in products, require greater federal collaboration on PFAS research, compelled PFAS cleanup at military installations, push collaborative agreements for cleanups that address state compliance concerns, and authorize funding for removing known PFAS from drinking water. Additionally, EPA has taken 9 administrative actions to advance major regulatory efforts for PFOA, PFOS, and some other PFAS. Instead of building on the work EPA has already done, the bills put in place mandates that ignore many legal and practical realities. These mandates will interrupt existing EPA activity or place unrealistic burdens on EPA's ability to handle the PFAS work it is performing. For example, the requirements for a comprehensive toxicity testing of every PFAS chemical would completely inundate EPA. EPA has already said PFAS presents numerous analytical challenges. Its scientifically validated analytical methods to measure only 29 different PFAS in drinking water. Forcing it to review over 9,000 chemicals under short deadlines is simply unrealistic, likely compromising the results of any review, and would leave the agency with little bandwidth to do its other important work. This includes areas that I am sure my colleagues think is important, like addressing greenhouse gas emissions and other public health priorities. Sections 2, 5, and 8 mandate that EPA stop undertaking scientific and legal due diligence and instead hurry up and issue regulations within a short time frame. This sacrifices using appropriate standards and actual reason in exchange for rushing through final regulations for PFOA and PFOS as Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, Hazardous Substance, a Safe Drinking Water Act, and Drinking Water Contaminant and a Clean Air Act, Hazardous Air Pollutant. Being designated under CERCLA, RCAA, are serious and dangerous designations that create enormous liability and cost. Section 4 would ban the commercialization of any new PFAS or any new use of a PFAS for 5 years. 5 years, without any of the mandated and rigorous scientific review required under Section 5 of the Toxic Substance Control Act. This again abandons the use of science in determining risk and shows a lack of confidence in EPA officials who make decisions based on evidence and science, instead of leaning on their expertise to build mandates Congress's political judgment on this entire class of chemicals. Another complicating factor of this bill are the deadlines EPA must meet to examine over 9,000 chemicals. When EPA inevitably fails to meet these demands, it will lead to litigation and results in settlements that will bypass using actual science and rulemaking. In closing, the majority has not been fully prepared for the full consequences of this bill. It will stunt American innovation. It will stunt American innovation, reduce our health preparedness, economic competitiveness, and standard of living, and help us to lose our children's future. Again, as I stated from the beginning, we want solutions. We get it. We understand. We need to address this, and we need solutions. But we should let EPA continue doing its job and make decisions based on science and not on mandates. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cole.
Thank you. I'm glad you showed up with Carter, because all my questions were directed at you. So,
thank you.
But I want to go back to this point that you made about the sheer number of chemicals we're talking about, 9,252, as I think you said. And if I'm correct, that master list would be subjected to comprehensive toxicity testing, but there's no exception for any PFAS chemicals that are currently used in manufacturing and have been previously vetted by the FDA or the EPA. Is that correct?
That is correct. You're absolutely correct. And that, the EPA has been doing their job. and they've looked at these two already, 2 out of 9,252. They got 9,250 left to look at and study, but they have looked at these two, and they have deemed them to be unacceptable. They're no longer made in the United States. They're no longer available, so.
But aren't there others in products that the product's been tested, maybe not the chemical per se, but the product's been tested?
Absolutely. There are medical devices. There are other products. As I mentioned in my testimony, the FDA has approved drugs that have PFAS in them. They've already approved them.
If they've been approved by FDA or EPA or some other appropriate authority, given the kind of product they're in, what happens? Tell me what happens once this list is out. I mean, are those products arbitrarily withdrawn? I mean, I'm not sure what happens if we're using something. We've said it's okay by one part of the government, and now we move legislatively to say, you can't use these things. What are the consequences?
Well, obviously, I can't list every problem that would occur, but I can tell you the ramifications are huge. I suspect that every one of you here today, with very few exceptions, either yesterday or today flew up here. Did you know that the seal around the doors on an airplane have PFAS in them? Now, do you want to do away with that? You want to make it a hazardous chemical right now? And that seal is no longer. Did you know that the foam that's used at airports to put out jet fuel fires contains PFAS? Now, look, if there were a fire, you want that fire put out as quickly as possible. And you want that there. Now, I admit and I agree, we need to study, we need to make sure, and we are cleaning that up. There are rules in place right now that have already been put in place that if there's a spill over, I believe it's 10 gallons, it's got to be cleaned up immediately. And there are guidelines by which they have to follow. This is, simply put, what we're doing here, we're killing a gnat with a sledgehammer. And we're putting enormous pressure on EPA that they don't need put on them. We've done our work over the past few years. There have been at least 31 statutes passed and signed into law addressing this. And there need to be more, and we're going to do more. But this is just too much, too quickly, that's going to cause numerous lawsuits. It's going to cause litigation. It's going to cause companies not to want to do any more research on these chemicals. It's going to cause companies not to want to use these chemicals, resulting in less innovation. When we talk about greenhouse emissions, when we talk about climate change, I've always said we got to have three things. We got to have adaptation, mitigation, and innovation. Now, that innovation is something that we can't tie the hands of people on innovation. And we'd be doing that if we passed this.
Well, you just answer a theoretical for me. Let's say that you're on this list, we've passed this legislation, it's part of a product. Does that make the manufacturer, even though we don't know per se that particular chemical is a problem, are they subject to litigation then because of the legislation that we've passed?
They are. And what's going to happen then? They're either going to stop using it, which is probably what they will do, and can you blame them? If the federal government says that it's a hazardous chemical without even knowing for sure? And isn't that what we have EPA for? For them to make that kind of determination?
How long would it take the EPA, I mean, it's an extraordinary list here, to deal with this? Do they have the adequate resources to, systematically, over some reasonable period of time, look at a group of chemicals this large?
Oh, it would take a while. It'd take more than what's mandated here. I mean, it's hard to say, exactly how long it would take, but it would take a lot longer than what we're suggesting in this legislation.
Just out of curiosity, what does it say? All 5 years?
5 years. The bill forces EPA to make regulatory determinations on 9,000 plus chemicals. Actually, as many as 18,000 plus determinations within 5 years. So we're going to tell EPA that within 5 years, you got to have this done. Now, I'm okay with putting with charging them with responsibility and with giving them guidelines and with giving them some stop dates, but this is unobtainable.
Just out of curiosity, was there any budgetary request by the administration that would position them to do this if we pass something like this?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, I sat through all the hearings last week. I can tell you not to my knowledge either in the appropriations bill. So with that, I'm just wondering if we're moving a little fast here, Mr. Chairman. That's all. I don't pretend to be an expert on the chemicals, and I'm heartened that both sides acknowledge that there's an issue here that we ought to be looking at, that there's action that needs to be taken. I'm just wondering if we're moving a little precipitously. But.
Yeah. No, and let me thank you. Mr. Carter said this bill is basically like taking a sledgehammer to kill a gnat. If I characterize what you said accurately.
It's a Southern saying, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know,
South Georgia.
let me just put one thing on the record here. I first became aware of this issue a few years back from a woman named Diane Carter. I'm happy to introduce her to you or your staff. Her husband was a firefighter, developed cancer way back when. She was being told by doctors that it's directly attributed to the PFAS that firefighters come into contact with, not only with the foam, but in the equipment that they wear. And back then, nobody wanted to listen to her. And back then, even fire departments weren't even sounding the alarm bells. It's very different today. And so she's made it her personal mission in life to make sure that nobody else dies from this. And so, you know, I think the urgency is that people are getting sick and people are dying, and there is evidence to tie it to these chemicals. And I think there's also an awareness that when you look over our long history with regard to our response to hazardous chemicals, it's kind of the same old that repeats itself. One is the manufacturers and the chemical companies say, nothing wrong with this. And then the evidence piles up, and then we have this whole debate over, oh, no, we can't change anything because it's too big of a deal. And then more evidence piles up and more people die, and then we finally, you know, end up doing the right thing. And I guess I just want to ask Ms. Dingell before I yield to Ms. Torres is, I mean, you know, why is it that we need to do this now, and why is it that we need to do this quickly? I mean, if 5 years is quickly, it seems like an awful lot of time for somebody who's worried about getting sick, but nonetheless, I think it'd be helpful to have your response. Yep.
Oh, go ahead. I'll wait for the response. I thought it was still my time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you yielded back.
No, I had not.
Okay, well, then I'll yield back to him after.
No,
you-
go ahead and
after
answer
you-
the chairman's question.
Yeah, I'm
please.
sorry. I didn't,
No,
I,
it's fair question.
I believe the question was Ms. Dingell?
yeah.
If you're someone who has PFAS accumulating in your blood, if you worked for the companies that was manufacturing this, if you've lost a family member, if you're the person that's suffering from cancer, if you've got family that's been serving at a military base where this has been identified at 328 military bases and no one's willing to clean it up, if you were someone that was living in Fred Upton's district when they had to turn off the water for the whole city, if you're living in a city that there's PFAS in your water and you're wondering who's testing it, you really want to wait another 10 years or 20 years? We've been waiting and waiting and waiting. We've known about this for a long time. I've been promised since I got here, haven't been here that long. Maybe somebody else was, but EPA keeps saying they're going to do it, and they haven't. You keep saying that this bill is going to make decisions for PFAS as a class instead of evaluating each PFAS based on the science, but that's categorically not true. This bill regulates two of the most studied notorious PFAS chemicals, PFOA and PFOS. Immediately, because the science is known on those two chemicals. We know the risk. We've known the risk for so long that the manufacturers voluntarily phased out those two chemicals over a decade ago. And for all the other PFAS, this bill would set up a comprehensive testing regime that will identify the differences between the type and the classes of PFAS and drive the science we need to make future decisions. This bill will give EPA 5 years to get that science down and evaluate it. Only then would EPA be required to make decisions based on science for other PFAS chemicals.
Thank you, and I apologize, I thought you were winding down.
Well, and I am.
All right, no,
And I'll just make this point. Look, I don't disagree with anything either of you had to say. And I don't pretend to be an expert in this area at all. I don't sit on a committee of jurisdiction. I do worry, I'm glad to hear there's a process, there's a timeline. As an appropriator, I would just say, I hope there's a budget with this, because you can authorize all you want. If there's no money there, extra money to fulfill a task of this magnitude, it won't get done in the 5 years. And you're going to have a lot of litigation. And you're probably going to lose some products along the way that are perfectly fine. So I'm just not sure we've thought through this, and I'm not talking about our two legislators here, Mr. Chairman. I'm just saying it doesn't seem to me we got a scheme to handle something quite this big. Maybe this will create the pressure to do this, but I just worry a lot of damage happens in the interim. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know a whole lot, about PFAS in general, but I do want to thank my colleague and remind her that we've been here 7 years, and I know that this is an issue that you've been working for quite a long time. Killing a gnat with a sledgehammer, I get it. It's Southern saying, but when I hear that, I think of someone relating that to somebody that I care very much about. Someone who just woke up one day and, found himself allergic to every single chemical that is in everything that we use. There is close to 6,000 types of shampoos. There are only 2 that he can use out of that list. There isn't anything that he could use on his skin without it going through this app, where his doctor had to upload all of the chemicals that he's allergic to. Deodorant, just the very basics, lotion, sunscreen. It is really unfortunate. And I know that you did not mean it that way. I'm not saying this, in a negative way. I am simply trying to say that and acknowledge, and I think that we should all acknowledge, is that PFAS are extremely dangerous. And I am so grateful that this bill requires guidance for the safe disposal. It authorizes grants to drinking water utilities so that the future generation will have an opportunity to grow up in a healthy environment, maybe. Establishes a voluntary label. It creates a public website containing information on household well water testing. We should know if our water companies are testing for this. And if not, we need to hold them accountable and demand that they do. It mandates development of PFAS risk communication strategy. Guidance to first responders. These are the people that are risking their lives not just by wearing equipment or using equipment, that puts them at risk. These are the people that we very much care about. So for that and many other reasons, this is very personal. I think 5 years is long enough. I think that the EPA should have been working on this as we were writing letters. I've been signing on to some of those letters that you have written. And if they haven't, then they better get their act together and better start moving in the right direction. And then if they can't get it done within 5 years, they can come to Congress, and I'm sure that you will work with them. So thank you, Representative Dingell, for bringing this up to us, and I support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To both of you, I do remember the markup on this bill, but I'm not sure I remember the hearing. Is this something that we looked at again this Congress? I know we've had hearings in previous Congresses.
May I?
Yes.
Yes, it is. We've had hearings in previous Congress, and this is something else. Let's be realistic, okay? It did pass last Congress. It passed the House, but it didn't pass the Senate, and it ain't going to this year either. You know that. Why? But yet every amendment that was offered by Republicans, and we are on the same page here, guys. We want to find this out too. I don't want anybody using something that's going to hurt them. I've dedicated my life to health care. I don't want somebody using something that's going to hurt them either. But at the same time, the point is that this is too much too quickly. Yes, we need to find it out. There's no question about that. But we need realistic objectives with realistic goals that can be achieved realistically. And this does not do that. Think about all the products that are used here. Think about the surgical mask. Did you know that PFAS is in surgical masks? It is. So what's going to happen? A company that is manufacturing surgical masks going to stop manufacturing or take that out of there? Is it going to be less effective? You know, doctors, and I don't know if there are any physicians here, but physicians take a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. I was a nursing home consultant, long-term care consultant for many, many years. One of the guiding principles that we use, do the benefits outweigh the risk? We need to know the risk, but think about all the benefits that this class of drugs has to us. And if we, and I have to take exception to Ms. Dingle here, this is more than just PFAS. This is more than just the two that have already been taken off the market. This is 9,250 other chemicals that are impacted by this legislation.
So I guess my larger point was, we had hearings in the previous Congress. Did the appropriate subcommittee hold hearings in this Congress?
It didn't go through the subcommittee, it went through the full committee, isn't that right?
I was trying to remember. It all runs together on me.
I believe that's correct.
So, we've just come through a pandemic. We've been concerned about our supply chains. It seems to me that we would at least have asked some questions or had some curiosity as to how this would affect what is happening at the supply chain level, because as you point out, this is going to affect a great number of products. Is that not correct?
That is correct. And, oh, by the way, solar panels, PFAS.
Dr. Bouchon, in our markup, did offer amendments to exempt some medical devices that he had used when in his practice of cardiothoracic surgery, because of the necessity of having an anti-clotting coverage for stents, and that these products would no longer be allowed to be used. Is that your understanding as well?
It's my understanding as well. I offered an amendment that was one of the many Republican amendments. In fact, all of them were rejected. The amendment that I offered had to do with airplanes and helicopter parts that are important to our defense.
Dr. Burgess, can you just yield for 1 second?
I'll always yield to the chairman.
No, you asked about hearings. Our records here show there were three hearings on this topic in the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Mr. Chairman,
why would there have been three?
Am I wrong?
You may be correct. I simply can't remember these things all do run together.
In the subcommittee, I'm sorry. No? What am I looking at here? Like I said, the energy, obviously, the environment and climate change.
In this Congress?
Yeah, Energy and Commerce's Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change held a series of hearings to develop and consider HR 2467.
When was this? This year? When were the hearings on this?
I may be wrong, so I'm just...
Mr. Chairman,
I'm
with all
reading
due
it,
respect, it's my understanding we've not had any hearings, nor have we had any input whatsoever from EPA.
And again, I'm not trying to be combative by bringing this up. We had this bill on the floor at the end of the last Congress. Many of these issues were discussed, as I recall, during floor activity. Can the EPA do what we've asked it to do with the numbers that we've asked them to perform in the time allotted? And then the sun set on that Congress I don't know if we came back to the subcommittee and asked those questions. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is because I think they're legitimate questions that someone needs to think about. And then in the interim, of course, we did have a pandemic and we did have serious supply chain issues. We need to know before just shutting the door on 9,252, is that right, compounds, how it is going to affect. And then to Mr. Cole's point, we all know the mantra of the appropriators, no money, no mission. I don't know that the CBO score that was provided in the last Congress is actually applicable to what would be required if this was indeed given a CERCLA designation. And I don't know that anyone has the answer to that, but that's just, part of this is recalling how we left things at the end of the last Congress. Okay, we have an election, we come into a new Congress. I'm not sure we've settled any of those issues. Obviously, I've got concerns that same as yourself, Mr. Carter, and that Dr. Bouchon brought up, the clot, anti-clotting coatings that are available on stents. It would be, there may be other compounds out there that can be developed, but the fact of the matter is, if they're not here yet, then these are still devices that are necessary. And then I'll have an amendment whenever it is the appropriate time. We also have the side issue. Anyone who's ever run a medical practice knows the very stringent requirements we're already under as far as handling medical waste, and how will this affect those red boxes that we all had in our medical offices. So I don't know, Mr. Chairman, is it appropriate to go into the amendments at this point, or would you?
I think you should wait until this panel's over with, then we'll go to amendments and we'll.
Very well. Look, I appreciate both of you being here. I know this has been a complicated and complex topic, and we do want to get it right. When you think of firefighting, there is another compound that's available in firefighting, unfortunately. That's asbestos. And I remember John Shimkus's very, very passionate comments on this as we went through this in another Congress, in another subcommittee. You can't take everything away just by a legislative fiat and not have anything in the armamentarium for those who are required to fight fires. Yes, we want them to be safe, but at the same time, we can't just we can't unilaterally disarm. I know Chairman Dingell, former Representative Dingell wanted to make a comment. You had your hand up.
Well, I wanted to say that, proponents keep saying that this bill would ban PFAS currently used in drugs, devices, or PPE. But nothing in this bill bans PFAS from those devices. The provisions in this bill deal primarily with pollution, not products. And the only statute covered in the bill that could regulate products is the Toxic Substance Control Act, but medical drugs and devices have been exempt from that statute since its inception. And look, I share with you, our Detroit airport had another PFAS spillage, which went into the Frank Poet Lake. I want to tell you, or Frank Poet Drain, I want to tell you about the late 70s man that can't catch fish in the Huron River because of PFAS contamination. And he got up right before we had the shutdown and said, I rely on that fish. When am I going to be able to eat that fish again? And I didn't know how to tell him, probably not in his lifetime. And under Republican Governor Rick Snyder, because he had set up a scientific committee to study the PFAS level in water, and we have a voluntary standard, Michigan set a stronger standard at the state level as a result of those experts than we have as a voluntary level at the federal level. I can't look people in the eye and tell them, do you know how many people have used Teflon cooking? You've got PFAS in your socks. Storage containers that you take home have PFAS in it. We've now seen a study on makeup. I look at all my makeup. Does it have PFAS in it? I can't tell. We don't tell people. People should be educated consumers, and at least we're only saying, let's study the two worst, the ones we know of. But what is wrong with science studying this and protecting the American people from something we know is killing some of them?
Well, I would answer that question by saying there's nothing wrong with having science study it, but I think, as Mr. Carter has already pointed out, the time frame that has been given to the EPA to be able to make that designation, it may be beyond their capabilities.
Well, I'm not going to tell people they should just keep dying because we don't have time to study it or do something about it.
Well, Mr. Carter, how many compounds under CERCLA have been studied and banned?
How many have been studied?
The total number of compounds that CERCLA has banned.
Of PFAS?
No, of just altogether.
I don't know.
It's around 800.
Around 800? Okay.
So we're asking them to do 10 times that much in 5 years.
Exactly.
And how old is a CERCLA statute? 25, 30 years old? I mean, this is a monumental task that we're asking. We're not asking, we're legislating, we're mandating they do it.
If I may, Mr.
I don't know if Tom has enough money in the appropriators pot to do that.
We never have.
He has the time. He yields you more. Yeah.
Yeah. May I?
Yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, Energy and Commerce staff has asked that I request 2 letters be entered into the record. Is this the appropriate time to do that?
Without objection.
If I may, the first letter, and this is contrary to the point that was just made by my colleague here, but this first letter is a letter from the Advanced Medical Technology Association supporting an amendment that provides an exemption for PFAS-containing drugs under FDA supervision. The second letter is a letter from W.L. Gore Associates that supports exemptions for PFAS-containing drugs and other important uses. Again, I would point to the fact that there are a lot of benefit to this class of chemicals. I agree, we need to, there are parts of this bill that are good. But there are amendments here that were offered by our party that have not been accepted that will make this bill even better. We all want the same thing here. There's not a single person in this room who wants somebody taking chemicals that are going to harm them. Mr. Chairman, I would submit this for the record.
Without objection.
I thank both our witnesses for being here. We've got a lot of stuff to cover. I'll yield back.
Yeah, before I yield to Mr. Perlmutter, I just want to insert in the record so people don't think I'm making things up out of thin air. The Energy and Commerce Committee report, which talks about the hearings that were held, used to justify the development of this bill, and there's 3 of them this year.
I talked to EPA. I specifically asked questions of EPA witnesses at those hearings.
So without objection, I'm going to put this in the record for that to be clear, and I yield.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Cole mentioned deja vu all over again. And quite frankly, we've heard this bill, I think this is now the 3rd time for me in the last 3 or 4 years. Mr. Shimkus, and the number 9,252 substances or different kinds of PFAS chemicals sticks in my mind. And so, Mr. Carter, I know that number well, but I was doing a little math myself. There's 525,600 minutes per year, and at least the last time we heard this, 1,051,200 minutes have expired. So you may be right that this bill is too broad, but it is not moving too quickly. We've been working on this for years now. And I guess my question to both of you is, so what is the EPA doing in terms of regulating in the process, or are their hands tied until we actually do something legislatively?
So I find myself wanting to sing the song, Promises, 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 Promises. EPA administrator was in Michigan last week. He told me he was looking at it. They've testified before the committee. But until we require them to set a drinking standard, the first hearings I had when I was a new member 7 years ago, as my colleague said, I asked about setting a PFAS standard for drinking water. American people should be safe from drinking water. We still don't have it. And communities are being poisoned across the country.
Mr. Carter?
There have been several acts and executive orders that the previous administration and this current administration have been taking. The Safe Drinking Water Act had the regulation of PFOA and PFOS, unregulated contamination monitoring, PFOS toxicity assessments. I mean, we've had 31 executive orders that have addressed this situation. I get it, I understand. I'm not against putting deadlines in place, but I'm just afraid that we are going to inundate EPA, forcing them to make decisions that are not science-based. And I think there's a danger there. This needs to be science-based, and if we put this kind of pressure on them, and I have to take exception about EPA's input into this. To my knowledge, EPA has not had any input.
Let me differ with you on that just for a second, because as I'm looking at and remembering the provisions of this bill, since we've heard it several times, I mean, one, it sets air emission limits and prohibits unsafe incineration of PFAS. Nobody disagrees with that. Requires the administrator, this is the one where I think there is some debate, within 5 years to determine whether other PFAS should be listed as hazardous substances. But that's 5 years. So we're saying to them, now you got to figure this out within 5 years. I don't think that's demanding too much. It may be too costly for Mr. Cole and the Appropriations Committee, but certainly I don't think it's problematic. Establishes health protective drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS. We should be doing that. I don't think there's any disagreement on that. This is one where you may be concerned, but again, it's not a, now or nothing. It's not banning. It says limits the introduction of new PFAS chemicals into commerce while test data is being developed. Now, you may be right. That may slow down innovation, but given the fact that this has been a problematic kind of a chemical, I don't think any of us disagree. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I had this very conversation with Mr. Shimkus 2 years ago. So I do understand the breadth of it. There are so many positive things that come from this chemical. I don't disagree with you on that. But I think we are setting timelines that are appropriate to deal with a substance that has been problematic, has hurt people. We've got, I don't know how many bases in Colorado where we've had PFAS problems from the foam, where there really is problem with the drinking water down in the off of Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. So I appreciate, your concern that it's too broad, but I think the time frame that has been established is more than sufficient for the EPA to do good science to regulate something that we do know can be harmful.
May I?
Yes, sir.
My response again is that these products have good uses. So, look, you want to talk about, I never want someone using a product that's going to harm them. I made millions of recommendations as a pharmacist to patients on what they should be taking. I took every one of them very seriously anytime I made a recommendation. At the same time, we have to ask ourselves, if we've got the opportunity to use a PFAS product in solar panels that's going to make solar energy even more available, even better for us, then the benefit that we get from that, does it not outweigh the risk? That's a question we have to ask.
But this isn't banning. This does not ban it.
But
it doesn't ban it. It
sets companies up for lawsuits and for litigation. They're not going to use it. They're not dumb.
All right. Well, you and I think there's a lot of agreement somewhere in there, but there isn't a ban, in my opinion. There is a lot of requirement about water and how healthy it is. Incinerating, those are specifically required. But the rest of it is for 5 years of study or before new chemicals are developed that they be tested. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I swear I did not do this on purpose, but going back to the last hearing we just had, I changed to Polar, which I did not know was made in your district, but I changed, no kidding, because my favorite seltzer water ranked highest on PFAS. You could not make that up. But that is why I'm drinking.
You made the right choice.
Yes. So,
and you sound better as a result of it.
I feel Mr. Chairman, I feel healthier already. So I was ranking member. I will just stop. I'm not helping out Congressman Carter. Congressman Carter, I was going to ask you questions, admittedly, because even though I'm a Yankee, I'm a sucker for Southern expressions. So I wanted to elicit some more from you, but for the sake of brevity and time, I'm just going to go ahead and yield back.
Thank you. You were killing me.
Mr. Raskin.
I want to get some of that Polar seltzer water. If I understand the gentleman from Pennsylvania correctly, he's saying it's got the lowest concentration of PFAS of the Polar seltzers?
I don't know that, but what I was drinking was actually rated the highest level of PFAS. I'm not making this up.
Well,
I didn't say that. He did.
Well, I appreciate that, and it goes right to my point. First of all, I want to thank the distinguished gentlelady from Michigan for her passionate advocacy on the PFAS issue for so long and for bringing it to this point, and I hope that this is the year that we finally have a breakthrough. And I appreciate also, Mr. Carter, your representation that none of us wants anybody to be unnecessarily exposed to toxic substances. As you said, there's nobody in the room who wants anybody to be exposed to toxic chemical. At the same time, I'd say there's nobody in the room that wants to ban surgical masks, and there's nobody that wants to ban airplanes. So when you ran through the litany of things where PFAS is found, that made me say, wow, this might not be a good idea if we're banning the substance. But this isn't a ban on the substance. This is a direction to the EPA to enter into hearings, the administrative process to determine whether it's hazardous and whether it should be declared a hazardous substance, and then to determine what action should be taken from there. So it seemed to me that the legislation totally comprehends your point of view, which is we don't want people to be unnecessarily exposed to it, and we need to enter into a cost-benefit analysis in terms of particular uses that are out there in the market, and that's precisely where we need to go. So please tell me what I'm missing, because I'm not reading in the legislation, as Mr. Perlmutter was saying, any ban on use of PFAS.
Look, like it or not, there are some PFAS chemicals that have specific properties that aren't easily addressed with other chemical types, like stability, water, oil stain, and heat resistance. And that means that crucial components that require this may not be made. These companies take this into consideration. If you're the CEO of a company and you've got a product, if you've got a foam that puts out jet fuel fires faster than what anything else puts out, you want that foam being used on that airplane where your loved one is in that plane and it's on fire right now.
But so, and here's what I'm not understanding. That is what the administrative process is about. So say somebody comes forward, just imagine it because I don't know the details, but someone comes and says, we cannot make surgical masks without a particular, PFAS ingredient. And then the EPA would say, we believe that the benefits absolutely outweigh the cost. There should be some kind of disclosure to the public or not use them unnecessarily or whatever. Isn't that what the administrative process is about? Why would we try to prevent that when all of us agree, as you're saying, on the underlying value that we don't want unnecessary exposure to the toxic substances?
And that's exactly what we tried to do through the committee process, which is where it's supposed to take place. We offered amendments that would exempt certain products that are absolutely necessary.
You want to go through 9,000 different chemicals with 50 million different consumer products, or you want the administrative agency to do that?
I'm not doing that. You're doing that with this legislation.
No,
you are taking 9,250 chemicals right there in this entire class, and you're lumping them into the same group and saying that they're all hazardous.
But my point is that if they are hazardous, and again, you've done the counting, not me, it might be 900 or 90, it might be 90 million, whatever it is, this is an administrative process duty. This is why we have an administrative agency to go through this process, to weigh the costs and benefits and then to determine how to act. So, in other words, I don't understand why this isn't a great opportunity for bipartisan celebration. What we're saying is we agree on the value, that there's a danger there, and we agree that we need fine-grained administrative determinations of when it should be used and when not, and now we're turning it over to the EPA. So, to my mind, I think this is excellent legislation. It's exactly what we need to be doing to blow the whistle. It should have been done a long time ago, and if anything, it's giving EPA a little too long, 5 years, but 5 years, okay, it is what it is. Let's move forward as quickly as we can so we can make it safe. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a kind of a clarification, but she's chatting there.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I wait. I didn't want to interrupt. Congresswoman Dingell, you talked a little bit about the EPA, and I think that Mr. Perlmutter was asking some questions about it, and you said you had the opportunity to ask some questions during committee. I'm just wondering, was the question asked, or do you know, I mean, were they asked for technical assistance or input into the bill, like, can we do this?
Yes, we have talked to the EPA.
Okay.
We have gotten their input. We have been working with them. And can I just address one question that we?
Well, and I wanted to ask also specifically, were they asked if they could meet that 5-year timeline?
We've talked to them. The president put out an administrative statement today supporting this bill, which we should provide for the record, I suspect.
Okay, but I guess they didn't specifically say,
No,
yes,
they
we can
did
meet
not.
this timeline. Okay, I was just wondering, because there was a lot of discussion about the EPA. And then Congressman Carter, you had mentioned, I think there was 9 amendments you had mentioned that Republicans had offered for during committee.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, and you mentioned a couple of them.
We were 0-9, by the way.
0-9, I believe it, yes. But I just want to make sure, or maybe get a little bit of clarification. You mentioned one had to do with helicopters and planes, but
yes.
I'm assuming that they would have improved the bill. And can you just discuss those a little bit and maybe explain how they were a little?
Well, the amendment that was my amendment, and it was an exemption for airplanes and helicopters for essential parts like the seal, as I mentioned, on the airplane door, which for all of us is extremely important. We want it to work. All of us at some point flew here or came in on an airplane. Most of us did. And that kind of thing's really important. I don't want it to be exempted. I don't want them to change. I want to make sure it works. And, even more so, I mean, Dr. Burgess mentioned about Dr. Bouchon during the hearing, mentioning life-saving medical devices that have PFAS in them. That needs to be exempted right now. If we know there's something out there that needs to be exempted, we at least need to be exempted so that we don't discourage these companies and don't put them under the auspices of perhaps having litigation coming their way. That's all we're saying.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. PFAS contamination is a huge, huge issue in my district and southeastern Pennsylvania, and I believe this act would really benefit the health and well-being of my constituents. For years, we've been dealing with PFAS contamination in our waterways. We have 17 sites of contamination, 2 now decommissioned military bases in Montgomery County with significant groundwater contamination. So with what we know about the health effects of these chemicals, we really need the EPA to have the statutory authority that this bill would provide. Wholeheartedly in support of the rule and the underlying bills, and thank you for bringing it to us. Is there anything you wanted to add, Ms. Dingell?
Yes, I would like to make it really clear that we are having, people are being frightened of things that they do not need to be frightened about. This concern that you keep, I love you, you know that, but it's not founded. The 2 chemicals that are directly impacted by this bill, PFOA and PFAS, are no longer being manufactured or used in this country because of a voluntary phase-out. They're not used to make medical devices. They're not used to make semiconductors. They're not used to make airplane parts. They shouldn't be in air emissions or in fluent. So even if listing something under Superfund were a ban, which it is not, PFAS that are currently being used aren't listed. Even if listing something under Superfund regulated use of that substance in any way, which it does not, PFAS that are in current use are not being listed. So why, you might ask, why even regulate PFOA or PFOS then? The regulations in this bill are about addressing legacy contamination from these chemicals, because while they're not in medical devices, they're in our drinking water. While they're not in semiconductors, they're in our land, in our groundwater, around industrial sites and military installations. And while they're not in consumer products, they're in your blood and my blood. That should bother all of us. So this is about, listing is about harmful releases of pollution, not products, and it's incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure this is not entirely analogous, but I was thinking during the conversation. My dad was a pipe fitter, and for much of his working career, he dealt with asbestos, and unfortunately, his early demise, and partly because of exposure to asbestos. And since he did pneumatic controls and pneumatics in buildings and heating and air conditioning, he used Freon. And I think to myself, you know, asbestos we don't use anymore because American ingenuity is such that we've discovered ways to insulate and use other materials that aren't carcinogenic to human beings, and we don't have Freon anymore because it depleted the ozone, was depleting the ozone, yet we still have refrigerants in HVAC units because American ingenuity and innovation figures out how to do this in less toxic ways. So I'm sure they're not entirely analogous, but feels very similar to the conversation. I think we'll figure this out, but I think the gentlelady from Michigan has done a great job of articulating this. I appreciate her leadership. I'm going to support the rule and support the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Mr. DeSagne, see him here. We go to Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank the gentlelady from Michigan for bringing this bill to our attention and for being so passionate about it. This problem has been occurring in North Carolina for years. And to anybody who wants to talk about the EPA, the new secretary of the EPA is from North Carolina and is probably the perfect person to address this issue over the next 5 years based on his experiences in North Carolina. And you are absolutely right, Representative Dingell. Every American has been exposed to PFAS. And the sad thing is that our first responders, our firefighters, and our military service people have suffered the most. And that is exactly what we have seen in North Carolina. The Cape Fear River, which feeds Fort Bragg, has been polluted with PFAS from Chemours, and formerly DuPont, and we know that. Representative Hudson and I have written to the EPA about this. This is a bipartisan issue in North Carolina. And testing of drinking water systems in my district, in the city of Raleigh and the town of Cary, have detected PFAS in drinking water. I've worked in a bipartisan way to protect North Carolinians, again, with Representative Hudson, and I have a bipartisan amendment with Representative Rouser to deal with the Wilmington area and their water supply on PFAS from GenX. This bill will accomplish a number of goals, including directing EPA to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance and establish standards to protect our drinking water from contamination. It will also authorize grants to drinking water utilities treating PFAS contamination, because our local water authorities know what's going on in the water and they need the money to clean it up. The amendment that I mentioned that Representative Rouser and I are doing, which is bipartisan, would make sure that those communities that are already undertaking these kinds of cleanups can participate in those grants, not just future, but communities like yours, and we really need to do that. So I support the underlying rule, I support our amendment, And I support this bill, and I'm very hopeful that the Senate will take it up and Secretary Regan can implement it. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to go to Dr. Burgess again. I think you want to speak now, while the witnesses are still here?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of amendments. The first, amendment number 12, would ensure that those responsible for an illegal, dangerous discharge of PFAS would bear the entire liability for their irresponsible mistake. During the markup in our committee, Republicans offered amendments to exempt manufacturers of certain products from the most onerous provisions of the bill. Section 2 of the bill requires the Environmental Protection Agency to consider placing the entire PFAS class under CERCLA as hazardous substances, which would be an unprecedented expansion of the Superfund law. The Superfund law is notoriously complex, but at least until our markup, its liability regime has really never been questioned. To be clear, CERCLA liability is strict, joint and several, and retroactive. In the Environment and Climate Subcommittee, the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee Chairman Paul Tonko stated during the markup that responsibility was the key determinant of liability. And this is quoting Chairman Tonko. Superfund liability is an important determinant that incentivizes parties to handle these materials responsibly and to take care to avoid releases. If parties do not cause a release of pollution, they will not have a problem. And if they do cause a release, they should be liable to clean it up. That's the end of the quotation from Chairman Tonko. So if this were the case, I'm sure many of the amendments we're now reviewing would be unnecessary, and we agree that the responsible parties should be liable. Unfortunately, that's not how Superfund liability works, but this amendment would ensure that the chairman's statement would be true regarding PFAS, so I urge support for this amendment. Amendment number 20 provides an exemption from the provisions of this bill for medical waste disposed of at healthcare facilities. For decades, medical waste has had a special category to themselves under both federal and state regulators, and in fact are already heavily regulated. The Food and Drug Administration, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Department of Transportation, and all 50 states have strict regulations governing medical waste. I know how important and how cumbersome many of these regulations can be. Adding another layer and liability on our healthcare providers will only make healthcare costs expand, and access to healthcare would be reduced. Unfortunately, the Energy and Commerce Committee had no hearings on this aspect, and we weren't able to fully consider the impact on our healthcare system. We simply do not have evidence that medical waste that may contain PFAS would pose such a problem, and we need to completely, and we don't have evidence that would require us to completely upset and rewrite all of the regulations on medical waste disposal. The current system does appear to be of medical waste disposal does appear to be working. And I would submit that in adding it under HR 2467 is simply a solution in search of a problem, and would urge support for the amendment. Those are my two amendments, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. As I said at the beginning, I think before you came here, Dr. Burgess, that a number of the Republican amendments that were brought before the Rules Committee all would have a point of order against them because they, CBO has determined that they would add to, there would be a cost to them. And we have tried to reach out to people to see whether we could work with you to adjust that, and I think we are being told that everybody thinks that if they change their amendment, that it would somehow undermine the point they're trying to make. So that's a rules problem that we have.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, We are the Committee on Rules for the United States House of Representatives.
No, I
And so we can make the rules.
I appreciate
and
that,
we
but just
can grant a point of order, and we do it all the time in our rule, right?
Well, just as the gentleman
We grant the
knows,
necessary waivers, and
just as the gentleman knows when his party was in charge, and we have followed the same rule when our party's in charge in terms of individual amendments, making them order that we don't waive points of order against those amendments we bring to the floor. So that, the gentleman knows that's the way Republicans did it, and that's the way the Democrats do it. So that is a problem, and again, we have tried to make that clear to everybody. And what I'm being told is that nobody wants to see whether that their amendments can be rewritten or adjusted. So
I don't know if that's entirely fair. I don't recall having had that conversation.
well, I haven't had a
Members of the
conversation
rules
directly with you.
staff.
I'm just talking to staff who
Well-
have notified.
My understanding, I don't think we have a CBO score on this bill. A CBO score on a similar bill last Congress was $300 million, but they.
We got it about an hour before the meeting, I'm told.
I'm sorry?
We received it about an hour before the meeting.
So you've got plenty of time.
Yeah.
But here's the point, Mr. Chairman. We don't know from the CBO, we don't know what this is going to cost. We have no earthly idea. The CBO gave us a generic score in the last Congress of $300 million, but that's purely on the administrative side. As far as the overall net cost, we don't have a good handle on that. And all I'm suggesting is these two amendments would provide us a little more distinction, a little more refinement. In fact, if we're exempting medical waste and using the regulatory scheme that already exists, it would seem intuitively obvious to the most casual observer that it would cost nothing. We're already doing it.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions of anybody here? Hearing, Mr.
Can I have a final word?
You can say, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clear up one thing, and that is, my colleague here has testified that the EPA has testified and been in meetings when this has been discussed, and I have to take exception to it. I'm being told that EPA has never been in a legislative meeting to testify on the mandates that are in this bill. And that's what is at question here. The mandates that are in this bill that are going to be handed over to EPA, forcing them to do this work. Look, we all agree we need to do more work on this. We all agree we need to understand this better. But the problem here is that you need to be careful what you're asking for here. And I don't feel that the majority is fully prepared for the full consequences of this bill. It'll stunt American innovation. It will stunt innovation. It'll reduce our health procedures. It'll reduce our health preparedness, economic competitiveness, and standard of living, and it'll help us to lose our children's future. We all want resolution to these issues, but we should allow EPA to do their work, make the decisions based on science and not on mandates. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And Ms. Dingell, because I'd like to be bipartisan, if you have any final word you want to say.
Well, I respectfully disagree with my colleague. I think this whole bill bases it on science. You know, I'm looking at my colleague from New York and his story of his father. And I've been doing a lot of research lately. And I go back and, you know, you can't imagine this in this day and age. But when somebody I know and love first introduced clean water legislation with Mr. Muskie, they were vilified across this country. People said, it will cost too much money. We can't do that. And we now know what the damages of water, of what that polluted water and the impact on the drinking water and across the country was. So we've known for decades we're poisoning people. I can't look at another person in the eye and say, you've got PFAS in your blood. It could be, you know, causing cancer, could be killing you, could be causing infertility, could be causing thyroid problems. Hey, but it costs too much money to clean it up. And I thoroughly disagree with you that there are not alternatives that are being developed to PFAS. You know, none of us, I'm a lousy cook. I needed that Teflon pan, but I've learned how to cook without other pots and pans without using that Teflon. There are all alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just should point out, there are many great PFAS-free foams and gear, for example, that are available for our fire departments. So, in the issue of fighting fires, I don't think it's a question of fighting fires or regulating PFAS. I mean, I think we can do both. And I think at this point we should. Ms. Dingell,
Could I put a letter in the record, please, that we just received from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Domestic Justice and Human Development and Committee on Pro-Life that is endorsing the PFAS Action Act?
Without objection.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions of this panel? Hearing none. The panel is free to go. You can. You can stay if you want, but you can leave. Any other members wish to testify in H.R. 2467? Seeing none, that closes the hearing portion of 2467. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 2668, the Consumer Protection Recovery Act. Subcommittee Chairwoman Schakowsky, Subcommittee Ranking Member Bilirakis, we are delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Subcommittee Chairwoman Schakowsky. Is your light on? Okay, you're all set. Okay.
Oh, there we go. And I was saying good things about you, Gus. Always agreeable, and I just appreciate so much his leadership on the subcommittee. So we're here today because right now, today, the Federal Trade Commission can no longer go to the courts to get consumers their stolen money. Right now, it is really open season in our country for scammers and fraudsters. Why? H.R. 2668, the Consumer Protection and Recovery Act that is sponsored by Tony Cardenas and myself and a number of other co-sponsors, is correcting the problem so that the Federal Trade Commission can fulfill its responsibility as the country's preeminent consumer protection enforcement agency. For over 40 years, the Federal Trade Commission used Section 13B of the Federal Trade Commission Act to sue in court in order to get consumers back what was stolen from them. And it was really effective. From cases over just the last 5 years, the Federal Trade Commission has returned over $11.2 billion to almost 10 million consumers. For example, Mr. Chairman, let me tell you, that would include $23 million returned to more than 127,000 residents of Pennsylvania. And Mr. Ranking Member, that includes over $16 million sent back to more than 108,000 Oklahomans. But unfortunately, in April, the Supreme Court actually held that looking carefully at the law, that that Section 13B actually did not allow the Federal Trade Commission to seek restitution. This is after 40 years of it being held up, or at least not contested, and protecting consumers. As a result, the court found that for example, a payday loan company that defrauded its consumers And in fact, the court found that it cost consumers $1.3 billion, but that they were not able to recover that fraudulent money and return it to consumers because of that change. So the court the court's decision has absolutely hurt Americans all over the country. And it has actually hurt also honest businesses that should not have to compete with these fraudsters. But the Supreme Court acknowledged that the Congress, in fact, could take the authority back and give the right to the Federal Trade Commission to return money to consumers and make them whole. So every day that we delay, American consumers, our constituents, our friends, our families, our loved ones are losers. The urgency is not hypothetical. Over $3.8 billion in potential relief is at stake in pending 13B cases that are waiting for decisions before the court. So beginning over 2 years ago, under both the Trump and Biden administration, the Federal Trade Commission members have pleaded with the Congress to pass legislation to restore the ability to get money back in the pockets of consumers. And that was Republican members of the FTC and Democratic members. So these pleas have come from in a bipartisan way, and the Consumer Protection and Recovery Act would absolutely restore Section 13B, where it was for, as I said, over 40 years until the court decision just a couple of months ago. This bill does not make any changes to the current legal act. This bill does not expand the scope of the cases that the FTC can bring. It does not allow any punitive damages. It is just the exact amount of money that was defrauded, that was taken from consumers. And finally, some have claimed that other FTC authorities could take the place of Section 13B, but this is just simply not true. Other authorities, such as Section 19, are either too weak or would take years and years to actually bring anything back to consumers. That money would be gone. And so we have a really great opportunity today to help consumers this week to get this done without any more delay, and we should do it together. I really look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make this happen. In some ways, it's a really small bill in the sense that it does one thing. It restores the authority, which is the most powerful authority of the Federal Trade Commission, to protect our consumers from scammers and return money, the exact amount of money, back into their pockets. And with that, I yield back and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member as well. And it has been great working with the chairperson of the committee. She's a wonderful person, and we agree on most everything. And also, she's correct in saying that the Federal Trade Commission wants to get, give them the authority to seek restitution for these people that have been defrauded. But they haven't really endorsed any piece of legislation as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know. So in any case, Republicans and Democrats alike want to protect consumers and ensure that the FTC has the tools to do so. And I will tell you that we do want to fix this, and we should fix it this Congress. Now, the language, there are a few things that need to be worked out, and hopefully they'll be worked out in the Senate if my amendment doesn't pass today. We demonstrated that during this pandemic, by providing the FTC with first offense penalty authority and COVID-19 related scams at the end of last year, which was great. So the intent is there. For this reason, it gives me no pleasure to oppose my good friend, Mr. Cardenas's piece of legislation. For purely partisan reasons, the majority has taken what should be a very bipartisan slam dunk measure and sadly twisted it into an effort to make them, and again, we've worked together really well, and hopefully this can be solved. It is now apparent that this legislation was never just meant to address the Supreme Court's unanimous 9-0 decision against the FTC for exceeding its authority. Instead, it is part of a much broader plan to remake our economy, as articulated, again, in the President's most recent executive order. If you review the committee report, you will see the record reflects that the majority rushed the process to move H.R. 2668. We've got to get it right, folks. But they rushed the process forward by crushing the minority's rights in what could have been a bipartisan victory. When the majority first held a hearing on COVID scams, we were pleased to profile legislation we enacted together to give the FTC new authority. The majority raised the 13B issue in the hearing, and the bill's sponsor even highlighted Senator Wicker's proposal from last year to fix 13B and use this opportunity to move a national privacy standard. We still believe there's a tremendous opportunity to do just that, and you know how important. We're way behind, folks, on this privacy standard, and I can go on and on about that as well. The majority followed that hearing by introducing legislation and scheduling a legislative hearing that would feature only one of the then 4 FTC commissioners, which is highly unusual. Despite our protests to invite the other FTC commissioners to testify, just as they had the week before by Chair Cantwell at the Senate Commerce Committee, we were told no. We were also told no to any other FTC reform bills being considered. However, the chairperson has agreed to hear the FTC bills at the end of this month, which I appreciate so very much. This is important because you will likely hear from the majority that the FTC commissioners wrote a letter in support of 13B fix last year, just like I said, and the chairperson said the same thing. But that is purposely misleading in order to conflate support for the expansive legislation here today. Committee members had no chance to hear what the Senate heard just a week before on the much-needed guardrails in this bill. And that's what's missing in this particular bill, folks. A standard, a reasonable person standard, and several other guardrails. We were then given less than a week's notice on Friday night that this bill would be marked up in subcommittee. This occurring within hours of receiving incomplete answers to a letter we sent to the DOJ and a seemingly coordinated response to our questions for the record from the FTC acting chairperson Slaughter shortly thereafter. Again, all occurring late on Friday night. The problems with this process did not go unnoticed by your colleagues, Chairman McGovern and the ranking member, as our chairman, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the full chairman, who I happen to like very much, and is, for the most part, a bipartisan chairman, also received criticism. He received criticism from the faulty process from his side of the dais during the full committee markup. As currently drafted, the bill grants the FTC with brand new authorities under the Section 13B of the FTC Act to seek financial penalties for what it alleges is fraud and anti-competitive behavior. It does not include any guardrails, as I said, for due process, which is so very important, to ensure the FTC is prevented from becoming a second legislative body, just like it did in the 1970s. History is now repeating itself before our eyes if this piece of legislation passes as is. I have remained at the table to address significant concerns with H.R. 2668 because I agree that a fix must happen and that we must give the FTC the ability to attain restitution for victims. I submitted an amendment that strikes the right balance between providing the FTC with new authorities to go after bad actors, but also places much-needed guardrails to keep the FTC from short-circuiting due process. This even goes a step further than the amendment that I offered at committee, which was the only amendment that received bipartisan support, by the way, by ensuring that pending cases at the FTC do not escape this new statute of limitations. My amendment also seeks to address our concerns with the statute of limitations by granting the FTC's 5 years as similar to other states and federal standards. Matter of fact, DOJ in most criminal cases uses the 5-year standard. Most states, for fraud cases, extreme fraud cases, use between 5 and 7 years. So the FTC would allow, again, the FTC to seek equitable remedies and violations dating 10 years back. That's what this piece of legislation does. As members learn in responses to our questions for the record, shorter statutes protect against surprises through the assertion of claims long after the conduct, when evidence may be stale or no longer available, and to encourage the timely filing claims by regulatory agencies. Notably, that the acting chair of the FTC could not cite cases that we're looking at that went back more than 5 to 7 years. And most lawyers will agree with me on this. Equitable remedies also discourage bad actors from seeking to violate the law in the future. And I believe a shorter statute will further discourage bad actors. And we're recommending 5 years in my particular amendment. That's why we have a statute of limitations. Additionally, I know my colleagues were concerned, again, that a 5-year statute may preclude the FTC from seeking remedies from bad actors, especially in cases like FTC versus Volkswagen Group of America. That's why my amendment would grant a grace period to the FTC if the Commission can prove an entity engaged in intentionally deceptive or fraudulent conduct which prevented the Commission from bringing a suit. The Court may allow the Commission to seek equitable relief beyond the 5-year statute of limitations. So under my language, then the Volkswagen would not prevail. I truly believe this is a compromise. Okay, now there have been letters sent to members of Congress stating that we should have a 3-year statute of limitations. I say 5. I'm willing to compromise on even that, but I'm not willing to compromise on this standard because most, and I have it in my remarks, but this is very common, the reasonable person standard, and I believe we should be using this. We use this under Section 19 as well. I truly believe this is a compromise, as I said, on the statute of limitations we can all support. It provides a reasonable time frame for the FTC to retroactively seek equitable relief while providing guardrails to exceed that under special circumstances. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge you to reject the pressures to make this committee process an extension of the committee files we were subjected to, and instead use this as an opportunity to get us to work together to properly empower the FTC and to put us on the road to a long overdue national privacy standard as well. I know that we can get this done, folks, if we work together, and I think it's a priority as well. We've got to fix 13B to get the restitution for our good people that we represent. thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the testimony of both of you. I just have a question, Mr. Chakowski. I mean, lowering the statute of limitations to 5 years, I mean, Mr. Baraka says the Volkswagen case would be covered under his adjustment. Then there's, what about the DeVry University? And there's a whole bunch, I mean, I was like, I don't really quite get why we would limit it to 5 years when we know that there are cases that extend beyond that, but maybe you can respond to.
Well, first of all, let me say that the only change, the one and only change we made in the 13B legislation is to add a statute of limitations, which was never on there for the past 40 years, period, at all. And you gave these two examples of cases that went well beyond 5 years, even 7 years. When we talk about the Volkswagen case, when defrauded consumers with having fraudulent fuel efficiency claims, and also the issue of DeVry. And I understand what my colleague is saying about that they could ask for more, but why shouldn't we set a limit that is reasonable? We don't have to then make application to extend it, but 10 years, I think, is reasonable, particularly until we beef up the Federal Trade Commission to be able to move these cases along, which I absolutely think that that we should. You know, there were some process complaints. I don't want to bicker over those. We had only one, the chairman, the acting chairman of the commission who came in. This was typical of the kind of procedures we had before when the Republicans were in charge, where you have the chairman or acting chairman as opposed to all of the commissioners of any agency come in and speak. And as you said, Mr. Bilirakis, we're going to have all the commissioners come later as we talk about more things that we should deal with, and I agree that we should deal with. But this is a narrowly crafted bill that doesn't make any changes except for this one. I wanted to just comment also on this other, he talked about the reasonable person standard. And that sounds reasonable, except that what the reasonable person standard generally includes is also that you have to prove fraudulent intent of a business, a company, for having defrauded a consumer. The problem with that is what we do on Section 13B is only ask for the return of money that should have gone to them. So for example, let's say you have a bicycle and someone unintentionally thinks it's theirs and takes that bike. Well, they are going to have to give you the bike back. We're not going to take them to court and have any punitive damages for them taking your bike, but they're going to have to return it. So having to go to court and actually prove intent is very different from the way 13B really acts. The other thing, and this sort of makes me upset because it also says consumer reliance on the fraud, that consumers should have seen that this was fraudulent. Well, not really. CIRM may be more adept at doing that, but and maybe someone can look at it and say, well, it was obviously a fraud. But for others, and we've certainly seen that, and as you mentioned, the bill that we did during the pandemic, ongoing pandemic in many ways, but that we want to protect seniors, et cetera, is a good thing. And so I think this standard that we have right now is if money or a product was sold to you and it was fraudulent, that you have to get your money back. That's really what this does, and it's very, very simple. So I just think that this doesn't go beyond anything we've ever seen before, and that we have a good bill here. And I just have to tell you, I find it hard to imagine that you don't want, that all of us don't want to go home and say to consumers that going forward now, tomorrow, today, that you are going to make sure that we're going to put that money back and make you whole for being cheated in some way. I
Thank you.
hope we'll get support.
And let me ask unanimous consent to insert in the record at this time the statement of administration policy, which is in support of passage of H.R. 2668. Without objection, I now yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you. I'm struggling a little bit with this, so I'm going to ask some simple and maybe even stupid questions, just, and don't hesitate to say that's stupid. But it seems to me like the difference here, the disagreement is just simply, or am I correct to say, the disagreement between you two is basically over the scope of the authority of the FTC, how much power they should have to right or wrong. Is that, I mean?
Actually, I think we pretty much agree on that the Federal Trade Commission should be able to make a consumer whole. As I said, there's no penalties.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, and again, I may be misunderstanding what's right in front of me, but let me read this to you and put the same question to both of you. A recent Supreme Court decision, AMG Limited Liability Corporation versus the FTC, the commission argued that Congress simply created two enforcement avenues, one administrative and the other judicial, leaving the commission the power to decide which of the two separate parallel enforcement paths it could take. That's really pretty broad authority for the FTC to be able to choose which direction it wants to go in. But do you guys, let me ask you that, is that the majority viewpoint? They have two possible remedies here, one administrative and then one judicial?
Well, we're talking about on 13B, you have to go to the court, and so an independent judge will make this decision. So we're dealing only with this question of when we're using 13B. That's what this bill is limited to. When it's 13B, this is how it proceeds. The judge will decide.
Okay, let me ask the same question to you.
Well, yeah, there are different avenues, and the court is correct. The Supreme Court is correct. You have Section 5, and you have Section 19. And I know that the chairperson, and I tend to agree that Section 19 is very difficult to recover restitution under Section 19, even though the courts give you, say that is an avenue and it is in legislation. That's why we do want to fix 13B. As the chairperson said, it was a 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court, so we do not have statutory authority. That's why we're here. But yeah, you have the administrative court, and usually the administrative court gathers all the facts, and then they'll pursue it in law. So we're on the same page, but I just want to tell you on the statute of limitations, again, I have some tolling language in there. This is a very reasonable bill, folks. It's very, very responsible. If someone is deceived, if there's deception, there are exceptions to this 5-year statute of limitations. One of the members in committee, who I think I respect greatly, in our committee on the other side of the aisle, mentioned that we need 10 years to solve the case, basically. This is what I'm paraphrasing. We need 10 years to solve the case. Well, that's not the case. I mean, you got to file under the statute of limitations, you have to file the claim prior to the 5 years or 10 years. Now, another point I wanted to make is I don't believe there is a standard under this current piece of legislation. I put a standard in there that is, the reasonable man standard has held up for so many years. So again, we've thought this out, and I think we've covered all the bases with my amendment.
Okay, well, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Perlmutter.
And not to get into the weeds too much, Mr. Bilirakis, but you sort of gone down this path, but when a court is sitting as a court of equity, I mean, they're looking for unclean hands, unjust enrichment. There really isn't this reasonable man standard on behalf of the injured party. The court is looking at the act itself, and I'm looking at disgorgement, Section 2. In a suit brought under subsection B2B, the commission may seek and the court may order disgorgement of any unjust enrichment that a person, partnership, or corporation obtained as a result of the violation that gives rise to the suit. So I think whether it's 5 years or 10 years, the FTC ought to get on their horses and get, some sort of remedy for people who've been defrauded. So, I mean, 5 years seems like not a bad time frame to me. 10 years doesn't seem like a bad time frame to me. I hopefully you guys can work it out, but I just appreciate the fact that this is being addressed. Absolutely. Because the Supreme Court, even if it's 9-0, I think has made a mistake here, and we need to correct it, and we need to correct it right away.
Well, they did give us, as the chairperson said, they recommended that we correct this in statute, and that's what we're doing right now. Now, yeah, the disgorgement is another issue as well, and I believe it's covered under both pieces of legislation, restitution and disgorgement, that the defendant should not have a right to keep the assets that were defrauded. In other words, we need to take away whatever resources he gained through this wrongful act.
Well, and I appreciate your efforts to try to, make sure you're improving it. I agree with Ms. Schakowsky. Just looking at it, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. In a suit brought under subsection B2B, the commission may seek and the court may order, with respect to the violation that gives rise to the suit, restitution for losses, rescission or reformation of contract, refund of money, or return of property. And you're trying to refine that a little bit, and I appreciate that. I would just continue to urge you to work together, as you apparently do very well in your committee. But as it sits today, I think it's a pretty complete piece of legislation. And
yeah, but you got to have due process, and that's where I believe the current piece of legislation is lacking. But thank you very much.
Okay, I appreciate that. I yield back.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, and wasn't even a close call at the Supreme Court, was it? I mean, a 9-0 decision. So clearly, the statute as it existed was, there were some difficulties with it. I will tell you, several years ago, Chair Schakowsky will remember this, we had, I think, some of the first oversight hearings on the FTC that have been held in almost 20 years. So we do need to keep up with what the FTC is doing. It is extremely important that this subcommittee does keep up. I find myself very much in sympathy with your 5-year limit on the statute of limitations. 5 years, I don't know if you say from the date of discovery, but clearly there has to be, when it was discovered that there was a problem. The Volkswagen case, bad cases make bad precedent. It was a bad case. I mean, they set out from the get-go to deceive, and they were quite capable at it. But 5 years, if it is 5 years from the point of discovery, I think that's an entirely reasonable time limit. And you do want to provide not an open-ended process, certainly by any means. And I think 5 years is a reasonable time frame to employ. again, I'm astounded that it was a 9-0 decision, that it wasn't even a close call at the Supreme Court. So clearly it's a defect that needs to be fixed, and they have kicked it back to us as the legislative body, and I'm glad to see that you're taking it on. Again, Mr. Bilirakis, I find myself in sympathy with you for a 5-year time limit on the statute of limitations.
Thank you. Did you ask a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
Purely, I was
All right, okay,
purely
thank you.
making a
All
statement.
right, thank you, thank you.
Well, I'll put it to you in the form of a question. I think a 5-year statute of limitations is very reasonable. Do you agree, Mr. Bilirakis?
You sure you didn't go to law school? 5 years is very reasonable with certain exceptions that we put into the bill. Meaning one particular exception is all pending cases will not have to abide by the 5-year statute of limitations.
If I could, the Federal Trade Commission actually has repeatedly told us that it can be next to impossible to discover violations so quickly. And, you know, we saw that in those 2 cases that we mentioned. There's been others as well. And the tolling, the allowing for additional years, they say has only helped in rare instances that after trying to bring suit, some additional action by the defendant prevents the suit from being filed within the 5 years. I think it's kind of nitpicky, frankly, and I really agree that, you know, 10 years is good too. We want to make sure that consumers get back in their pocket what has been taken from them, and it seems a reasonable time, given the examples that we've seen, to go to 10 years. As I said before, there was no statute of limitations at all. We're adding that now to this legislation, but for 40 years, when the 13B was in effect, it didn't even have one. So,
Madam Chair, I don't want to be out of order, but I have an idea. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but why don't we remand this particular bill back to committee so we can hear from all 5 commissioners next week when they're here? That's just a suggestion to get it right.
Thank you for the suggestion. You're right, it's not in order. Mr. Burgess, I believe this is your time.
I'll yield back.
You yield back. Great. Mr. Ruskin.
Madam Chair, thank you. I want to thank you, both of our witnesses, for modeling real civility and harmony and how chairs and ranking members can work together. So that's great. It's hard to imagine a more important bill to American consumers than the one before us. I mean, this is a stunningly important bill. For many, many, many years, the FTC had the power, if somebody was defrauded, to go in and not only to get an injunction to stop them from engaging in that practice in the future, but it had the power to go in and use the tool of restitution to get them their money back, to get them a refund. And then out of the blue, the Supreme Court, in its infinite and unanimous wisdom, just said, you don't have that tool anymore. Now, it did say Congress should pick up the slack and deal with this, and that's what we're doing here. So this bill strikes me as a clean shot. It's very well drafted in order to restore this critical power so that people can get made whole when they get ripped off. So in my district, I had a group of seniors who ordered masks during COVID-19, or which we're still in, of course, and they were ripped off. These were not the regulation masks. They didn't work, and so on. And why should the FTC not have the power to get an injunction against the company that sold them this, and also get a refund to the seniors in my district? I mean, that strikes me as the most common sense proposition in the world. Now, Mr. Bilirakis, you seem to agree generally, I think, with what the chair is saying here, but you said you think there should be a specific intent standard. Here's my problem with that. Specific intent is a standard that comes out of the criminal law. In tort law, the only place I'm aware of us using specific intent is either for intentional torts like assault or something like that, or when the plaintiff is going for punitive damages. If you want to say what this defendant did was so horrific, you should not only get me my money back, but you should make them pay me an extra $50 million to prevent anybody else from ever doing the same thing. But that's not what's going on here. This is just restitution. So why would we import a specific intent standard from criminal law into this tort field when we're just talking about making our seniors whole, for example?
No, first of all, in the legislation before you, there is no standard. And you've got to have guardrails, folks, because, sure, I'm all for the FTC going after bad actors, and I've proven that, okay? But you've got to have guardrails.
Is your mic on?
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. You've got to have guardrails, and because otherwise, you got to have due process. And sure, a reasonable person would know if anything happened, intentionally, I would think. I mean,
I'm sorry, I'm not following that. Wait, would you, just break it down for us so it's simple. I mean, what is it you think the FTC should have to prove?
They should have to prove that these people did something knowingly.
Knowingly,
knowingly,
okay, yeah.
Knowingly.
But okay, now going back to the case of my constituents, say that the people who ripped them off, they got ripped off in turn, right? So that they thought, maybe they didn't really do their due diligence or whatever, but they didn't know for sure that these masks didn't work. But why should that make any difference?
Well, I'm talking about the defendant should knowingly.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, why should it make any difference whether they knew or they didn't know that they were ripping people off?
Yeah, I think that there should be restitution given to them.
Yeah, and so what we have now, as I understand it, is a strict liability standard. If you rip off my constituents, they get their money back, whether you did it on purpose, whether you knew, whether you did it recklessly, whether you did it negligently, whatever level of culpability you want to say. You rip somebody off, you pay them back, you give them their property back. So I think it just confuses the issue to say we need due process. Due process is built into this. The due process is the act of committing fraud against someone, improperly depriving them of their money or their property, I think. So, and again, I don't know where the reasonable person standard comes in. I haven't seen your amendment, but reasonable person as to what? In other words, the seniors who got ripped off in my district need to prove that they acted reasonably in relying on a fraudulent representation? I mean, how can anybody ever act reasonably in relying on a fraudulent representation?
Yeah, I don't think it's a very high standard. I think that people would know if they're being ripped off, and that the reasonable person would have knowledge that he's being ripped off. And that's why she's getting ripped
American consumers get ripped off billions of dollars a year and don't realize they're being ripped off. That's the whole essence of being ripped off.
Agreed.
Is you don't know you're being ripped off, right?
Agreed.
So if you say that I only get my money back if I acted reasonably in relying on the representations of a con man, when does anybody ever reasonably rely on the representations of a con man? Right? So, but here's the thing. I don't know why we're entering into a whole manipulation or revision of the level of mens rea, of intentionality. All of that is already built into the statute. The only thing that was stripped away by the Supreme Court was the authority of the FTC to go after restitution. And we're restoring that. We don't need to get into all of these other questions.
I follow you. I follow you.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's my view. I mean, I really think this bill is of the utmost importance to the American people. And America needs to know that the FTC was stripped of a critical power. We're going to restore it, and the government needs to have that power.
And
Yes.
I just wanted to add, to your sense of urgency, my sense of urgency, and I think all of our sense of urgency about that, because as it stands right now, there are over $3 billion worth of cases of fraud that they will not have to restore that money to consumers as long as we are not acting.
I mean, it's an amazing, to me, I'll close with this and I'll give you a final chance, Mr. Bilirakis. To me, basically what the Supreme Court has done is to say to the government, well, you can get the con men to stop in the future, but they get away with their ill-gotten gains up until now. And that just makes no sense. If there's a due process violation, it's against my constituents who can't get their money back. If we're talking about due process violations, how about the people who are getting ripped off and the Supreme Court pulls a rabbit out of a hat and says that the FTC doesn't have the power to get them their money back? So, I mean, let's make government work for our people.
Again, I do have these guardrails in the bill to address those particular issues. I really do. If we could sit down and talk about this, I'd be happy to. And if there's any way we can improve the bill, I'd be happy to. And of course, I have a great relationship with my chairperson. But
great. Let's make it bipartisan.
Most of the things you mentioned are covered under my particular piece of legislation. But we'd have to talk about the standard.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back, Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm just glad my Republican colleagues are allowing me to continue to ask questions today. Mr. Bilirakis, so twice due process has come up at the end of a line of question, and I just feel like maybe you haven't got a chance to, would you like to elaborate on it? Because I know you've ended on due process concerns.
Again, you can't just have an empty bill and give the FTC the authority to go after people that may not be guilty, and there's no wrongdoing being done. And so you do have, I mean, there has to be due process. There has to be a right for people to respond to something like this, obviously. And I think that under the current legislation, without my amendment being passed, listen, I mean, this is not my take-home bill, for crying out loud, but I'm trying to do it right, so we won't have to come back and amend it next year. But I do feel that there is an urgency. The Senate has language. We have language here, and we can get this done by the end of the Congress. But we've got to get it right.
Thanks, Mr. Bilirakis. With that, I yield back.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing this important bill here. I know that in Pennsylvania, our seniors lose $1.2 billion to fraud every year, and it's been an increasing problem. So we really need the FTC to have back its authority to deal with these issues. Representative Sienkowski, we've been talking about the due process issues, but there's due process, there's procedures as part of this bill, right? None of the procedures were changed by the Supreme Court decision.
Gives the Federal Trade Commission the right to go to court in front of a judge to present this case. And the outcome that certainly then can happen is that if a consumer was defrauded, individual consumer in your district, to the tune of $100, that particular person would get $100 back. Okay. It's that simple, but it's the court process, due process, that would decide that.
And it's so important. I mean, we hear from seniors and others, veterans, all the time, folks trying to address these issues, and they're not really interested in injunctions. They're interested in getting their money back. Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach.
And I'm with you 100% on that, as far as my language. We agree on that. There's no question. I have seniors in my district too, and I fight for them on a regular basis, so they should get restitution. And there should be, and disgorgement should also be in place as well, to take the money back from the bad actor.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I just wanted to, I don't have any questions in particular, but just wanted to say I think there is a lot of a lot of room for improvement and compromise here, and I wish you would go back to the table and work it through before you bring it back, before it goes to the floor, because I hear lots of discussion about things that there is the opportunity to come to agreement on. And I would just like to ask Ranking Member Bilirakis if he had anything he wanted to add at the end.
No, I appreciate that very much. Again, we're legislators, and we want to do it right, okay? And I don't want to do it based on emotion, and I want to do it based on fairness. And we do have to go after these bad actors, and we both agree on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the gentlelady from Illinois for bringing this before us. I'll admit this has been more confusing, this discussion, than I expect. Usually I end the discussions with a little more information, a little more knowledge about it. I think I'm more confused as this discussion goes on. As I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Schakowsky, the court essentially said that the FTC lacked the ability to seek restitution. Doesn't have anything about fundamental rights of due process. This has to do with whether or not they have the ability under the current statute to be able to seek restitution. No more, no less. And what I think you're seeking to do is restore what has been the long-held practice of the FTC to seek restitution for defrauded individuals. Am I making this too simple?
That's exactly right. Today, the only thing the FTC can do is say, don't do that again.
Again.
That's it.
So, respectfully, as much as I like us to seek bipartisan compromise and solutions, I'm not sure what we're arguing about. This seems pretty bipartisan. Just vote for it. It's the right thing to do. It restores the proper balance to the FTC to seek restitution for people who have been adjudged already, right? This has already been adjudicated to have been defrauded. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something, but I appreciate your leadership and I appreciate all the hard work that's gone into this. But I will support the rule and the underlying bill, and I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I don't see Mr. Desaulnier on video. Pausing just to make sure. Ms. Ross.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'm with Mr. Morelli. This is a remedies bill. After the Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court said the law only allowed one remedy, cease and desist. It is up to us to decide if the FTC can go to court to get another remedy. That would be compensating people for their injuries, people who have been defrauded. I trust our judges who deal with compensation of people for their injuries to know what to do. So all this is doing is adding a remedy so that people who are defrauded, who have come to the FTC, can get money back for being defrauded. Right now, we have a president who has had to forgive student loan debts for people who were defrauded by private institutions of higher education and people providing loans. So that means taxpayer money is having to go to pay for those people who have been defrauded because there are not adequate remedies. The people who do the defrauding should be the people who pay people back. We should let the FTC have this power, and we should let them go to court to enforce it. Plain and simple. Thank you so, so much for bringing this important bill that will help not only our seniors, it will help folks in the military, it will help people who are younger, it will help everybody. And the people who have caused the injury will be the people paying it back, not the taxpayers. I support the rule and I support the bill.
Thank you.
And I yield back.
Thank you. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question of the panel? Hearing none, you can go. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to testify? Dr. Burgess. Did you want to testify? Okay.
So amendment number one, to HR 2668. This amendment would make it unlawful for any person to engage in a pattern or practice of sending written communications that state or represent that the recipients are or may be infringing or have or may have infringed a patent regarding COVID-19 related products if done so in bad faith. Mr. Chairman, for a number of years, I've been very concerned about what are known as patent assertion entities or patent demand letters that are generated and sent sometimes in large quantities with the idea that they would get some people to simply pay money to make the assertion go away. And I've become concerned as we've talked about the FTC and we talk about some of the coronavirus issues that have surrounded the FTC, that this is an area where these targets may be, in fact, increasing. I've introduced this amendment as a standalone bill. It's 3978 for people keeping score at home. And patent demand letters limit innovation. They foil progress by threatening legal action when none, in fact, could be justified. We're finally starting to see signs of recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. And it would be a shame to see that derailed by a flood of patent assertion letters. So amendment number one, I would encourage the committee to make an order and allow it to be voted on the floor.
I thank the gentleman. I've been told that it's not germane to the bill. So.
And I reassert that we are the Rules Committee. Everything is germane within the realm of the Rules Committee.
Right, but the Rules Committee has some rules that we have to follow, and so, like, if it's, let's take it, for example, a basketball game. If you go over and you punch the guy on the other team, you know, it's against the rules. Can't do that. So we're trying to maintain some semblance of some rules here, and so, as you know, we don't normally make Republican or Democratic freestanding amendments that are not germane in order, but I appreciate the gentleman. And if I was in his seat, I'd probably say the same thing. But, and you'd say the same thing.
I think you have said the same
thing.
When you were in the seat.
But, you know, not as eloquently as Dr. Burgess. So.
I dispute the analogy that you've provided.
All right, anybody else, any other questions of Dr. Burgess? Hearing none, is there any other member that wants to testify in HR 2668? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on HR 2668. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of HR 2467, the PFAS Action Act of 2021. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee Print 117-10, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill, as amended, shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that following debate, each further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, not earlier considered as part of the amendments on block pursuant to Section 3, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debated for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subjected to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or his designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report or amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of the resolution. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2668, the Consumer Protection and Recovery Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-11 shall be considered as adopted in the bill as amended and shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 3985, the Allies Act of 2021, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit. Finally, the rule provides that at any time through the legislative day of Thursday, July the 22nd, 2021, the Speaker may entertain motions offered by the Majority Leader or a designee that the House suspend the rules with respect to multiple measures that were the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative day of July the 19th or 20th, 2021, and on which the yeas and nays were ordered and further proceedings postponed. The chair shall put the question on any such motion without debate or intervening motion, and the ordering of the yeas and nays on postponed motions to suspend the rules with respect to such measures is vacated.
Thank you very much. You've heard the motion from the gentleman from North Carolina. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to move an amendment to the rule to provide for an open rule. Since you now have the record as the longest majority in history to go without giving an open rule, I thought this would be a good opportunity to retire from the field honorably and actually have an open rule. And seriously, on 2467, there seems to be some reason for, everybody agrees on the problem. They just don't agree on how fast and what ways we ought to fix it. That discussion might be helpful. And on the second bill that would be subject to this, 2665, again, the parties don't seem to be all that far apart, quite frankly. It seems to me like the length of the statute of limitations and one or two other things. So open rule there actually might get them to the same point we'd actually have it. So anyway, I would like to hope you would consider having an open rule on this particular piece of legislation.
I heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
You already have the record. You don't need to keep piling it up. But on that, I request a
Roll call has been requested.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier?
He said no.
He said no.
No again.
Oh.
There you go.
Say it again while we see you.
Yeah, we can't just have the voice.
Okay, there we go. Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
He's
No.
right here. He's right here.
There you go.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Yes, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman, I
Burgess.
have an amendment to HR 2467. I move that the committee make in order amendment number 12 offered by myself. This amendment would ensure that those responsible for an illegal, dangerous discharge of PFAS would bear the entire liability for their irresponsible mistake. This bill requires an unprecedented, the underlying bill requires an unprecedented expansion of the Superfund law. Republicans agree that liability should reside with the parties responsible for the contamination via hazardous material for a PFAS discharge. This amendment would ensure that only those directly responsible would bear the liability. And this amendment is in line with statements made by Chairman Tonko in the subcommittee that parties who do not cause a release of pollution should not have a problem, and those who do should be liable for the cleanup. And I believe those remarks were underscored by our witness, Representative Dingle, during the witness testimony part of the hearing. So I urge support of this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned before, I think this amendment has a scoring issue. So I would urge a no vote. Anyone else want to talk about?
Well, Mr. Chairman, just on the scoring issue, if you look at the CBO report, the underlying bill has a scoring issue. The total score on the bill is $280 million over 10 years, but they state in the verbiage beneath that there's no way to know the amount of money because you don't know what the subsequent liability is going to be.
Well, as the gentleman knows, this committee, I don't think has ever, provided waivers for amendments with scoring issues going directly to the floor under Democratic or Republican administrations. Maybe when you're back in charge, you can change that. But right now, we're not going to.
Well, I'll certainly consider it. It's just the point is that the underlying bill actually has that same defect.
Again, all I'm simply saying is that what we're doing here is nothing new or unusual or different. And so I would urge a no vote on the Burgess Amendment. All those who favor the Burgess Amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Amendment to HR 2668. Amendment number 2. This is an amendment to the rule to make in order. Amendment number 2 offered by Mr. Bilirakis to HR 2668. The amendment clarifies that the Federal Trade Commission may only seek restitution and disgorgement in cases involving unfair or deceptive acts or practices in which a reasonable person would have known the potential violation under consideration was unfair or deceptive, and reduces the statute of limitations from 10 years to 5 years, but also includes an avenue to allow the Federal Trade Commission to seek equitable relief with respect to violations where a corporation engaged in an intentionally deceptive or fraudulent conduct that prevented the commission from bringing the suit within the 5-year statute of limitations. And Mr. Chairman, I think you must agree that it is ironic that the only bipartisan action on the legislation is an amendment that has been blocked by the Rules Committee from having even a debate on the floor of the House. It's unfortunate that the Speaker, in her attempts to maintain an iron grasp over the majority, continues to block reasonable and thoughtful bipartisan solutions from going forward. There is no more prime example than the Bilirakis Amendment, a bipartisan compromise that would reinstate safeguards and address the concerns of both sides of the aisle while still ensuring that the Federal Trade Commission has the appropriate means to protect consumers. This represents the Republicans' earnest attempt at an alternative It received bipartisan support in the committee, and I certainly hope the good work of the subcommittee ranking member to find bipartisan agreement does not go unnoticed, and that the Speaker eventually decides to change this approach and allow for common sense solutions where we can all find agreement. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Neither chair, the noes have it.
And we'll ask for a roll call vote.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendments?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 5 offered by Mr. Bentz of Oregon to H.R. 2668. This amendment codifies the FTC policy statement from 2015 about bringing Section 5 unfair methods of competition enforcement actions in light of consumer welfare standard. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would require the FTC to use its new authorities in this bill pursuant to the 2015 bipartisan policy statement. With this amendment in place, the FTC and the judicial system would not be able to order relief based on an alleged unfair method of competition if the FTC brought an enforcement action to court that was inconsistent with the bipartisan policy statement. This 2015 bipartisan policy statement enacted by the Obama administration was rescinded by the Biden administration on July 1 and was met with vehement disagreement by the Republican commissioners as they feared it could lead to much more harm than good. By returning to this bipartisan policy statement framework, the FTC's enforcement principles will once again be anchored in sound policy and good governance rather than aggressive regulatory framework with the Biden administration it appears to be headed for. Certainly, whether you agree with the need to return to the 2015 bipartisan policy statement or not, this amendment deserves a full and proper debate on the House floor. I urge adoption of the motion, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I thank the gentlelady for the amendment. Let me just say, I'm going to urge a no vote on this, but let me just say one thing. This amendment came in extremely late, and we have to vet all these amendments. And we tried to be accommodating to the best that we can on many of these and work with people, but we need to get Democrats and Republicans to submit their amendments at least the day that they're due, even if it's late that day. But this came in very late. I mean, to be honest with you, we didn't have a chance to do the vetting and all the stuff that we have to do with all the various players that are involved in this, from the parliamentarian on down. So I don't even know what to say other than to say that I think we ought to just make sure that we encourage all of our members to get amendment, to listen to the deadline, so we have time to be able to vet all these amendments. So I would urge a no vote on this. Any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Either chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I'd like a roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? If not, the vote is now on the motion of the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All those in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Mr. Chairman, recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Morelli?
Aye.
Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross? Aye. Mr. Neguse?
One more time, Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Okay.
Mr. Neguse? Aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Eschenthaler? Mr. Eschenthaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and Ms. Ross will carry it for the Democrats.
And Mr. Burgess will handle things for the Republicans.
All right, that's it. Thank you very much. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.